Well, according to RENCAP, the billion Africans who in the past decade have experienced the fastest growth the continent has ever seen are set to become the fastest 2 billion, and the African GDP is set to increase from $2 trillion today to $29 trillion in today's money by 2050. Joining us on the line for more, Charles Robertson, Global Chief Economist at Renaissance Capital. Charles, great as always to have you on the show. So, of course, you called it the fastest billion. You're referring to the billion or so people who live on the continent. But tell us about the parallels you've drawn between Africa's growth story and then I suppose Asia's growth story as well as India's.
Well, what we were trying to achieve with the book was to both bring what is a very positive story in lots of ways about Africa to the audience in Europe or America, which is much less familiar with it. But what we also wanted to do was give your audience, people who watch CNBC Africa, who do know some of the positives that have been happening. We wanted to give them something different from your average book, which is out there talking about the transformation that's happened. So what we've found is that the story, the growth rates of Africa in the last 30 years, particularly sub-Sahara, is identical to what we saw in India from 1960 to 1990. So 2 decades of poor, weak growth, around 2% in sub-Sahara in the 80s and the 90s, the failed decades. And India had the same in the 60s and 70s. It was called the Hindu rate of growth at the time. Something happened in the 80s in India. No one can explain it today fully, but growth picked up to 5.5% towards 6% a year for a decade. And that's what we've seen in sub-Sahara in the last 10 years. Because that's what took us up to India in 1990, if we assume the parallel of the last 30 years carries on for another 20, we already know what India's growth has been for those 20. And that's telling us that sub-Saharan growth is going to be hitting the 9% on average among the low-income countries in the 2020s and double-digit rates of growth in the 2030s. It's going to be quite a phenomenal set of numbers, and we've been able to draw out what that means for each country, or for some of the major countries over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years.
And of course, Charles, you've been brave as an economist, choosing to go where some fear to tread when it comes to long-term predictions. So tell us about some of these forecasts you have for 2050.
Well, to take Nigeria as an example, Nigeria is facing many infrastructure problems right now, problems that would have been very familiar to anyone looking at India around 1990. They are getting enough right to produce growth of 6 to 7%. What we're saying is that Nigeria will be as big as Germany, bigger than South Africa by 2014, as big as Germany is today by 2037, as big as Japan is today by 2047, and by 2050 we'll be talking about roughly a $6 trillion economy with 400 million people, the 4th largest by population in the world.
We're now looking, though, at the likes of China and India slowing, and they have, of course, had many bumps along the way. When it comes to policy making at this point in time, what are some of the lessons that African leaders can take from some of the hurdles that they've faced to make sure that they don't face these issues further down the line?
Well, I think one of the key things for us is to recognize that you have to look at countries as they are, not in terms of how quickly can they catch up with China, but we've got to think about where was China 10 or 20 years ago, where was India 10 or 20 years ago. And the thing I think which surprised us the most is the demands on infrastructure, which will continue to boom. So even now, 20 years from where we think sub-Sahara is today, even now India has big infrastructure problems. They still had electricity outages bringing down a third of the country just early this year. Planes, we think there's going to be 100 million, roughly 100 million flights a year taking place in Africa now. That's going to double every decade in a compounding way. So by the time we get to 2050, there's going to be 1.7 billion flights a year happening in Africa. That's a 17-fold increase.
Yeah.
It means that the new airports being built or the terminals being built in Kenya, Nigeria, they need to be thinking big when it comes to infrastructure.
Charles, there we go. Don't underestimate the insatiable demand for infrastructure as these economies grow. Thank you so much for joining us, as always. Charles Robertson, Global Chief Economist at Renaissance Capital, on their latest book offering the fastest billion.